What's up everyone, welcome back to another episode of AWS tutorial. And today I'll show you how to build a Node.js API with the Dynamo database and then host it on the Elastic Beanstalk. But before we get to the implementation, I want to talk about what exactly Elastic Beanstalk is. So it's basically an AWS service that uses EC2 instances under the hood. But one of the benefits that it has over traditional EC2 instances is that you can let it manage all the DevOps stuff for you with no extra cost, such as provisioning the EC2 instances, doing all the load balancing, auto scaling, and doing all the health monitoring for you as well. So this is like an ideal candidate for beginners because it's very easy to get started with. But with that being said, if you choose to, you can still have full control of your resources. Now that we learned about Elastic Beanstalk, let's build an API and host it there. Alright, so right now I'm on the homepage of the AWS console. So what we're going to do first is we're going to create a DynamoDB table to host our data, and then we're going to write the code for the API. And then finally we're going to create the Elastic Beanstalk to host the API. So let's type in DynamoDB, open that into a new tab. Hit create table. I'll just call it product inventory. And then for the partition key, I'm just going to use product ID. And I will select string as the type. You have the option to add the sort key here, but for simplicity, I'm just going to ignore that. And then use everything else as default. Create. Alright, so it's done. And now let's move on to step number 2, is to write the API. So I'm just going to open VS Code and then navigate to the folder you want to save the project. I'm going to create a file called package.json and then define the project name as Node.js CRUD API and then author. I'll just type in my name. Version is 1.0.0. Dependencies. We're only going to have 2 dependencies here. One is the AWS SDK, and I believe that is the latest version. And then the other one we're going to use is called Express, and that is the latest version as well. And now I'm going to create another file called app.js. So this is going to be the entry point of our API. First thing first, I'm going to import some libraries. And then I'm going to define app, express, and then I'm going to define a variable called port. Alright, so this line here is very important because we're going to host the API on Elastic Beanstalk, and we're going to use Nginx as our container. We're going to let Nginx to use the default port to route the traffic, but this is going to be used locally when we test it. And then I'm going to define a product router. Don't worry, we're going to define this file later in a minute. And then we're going to let app to use express.json. And we're also going to let app to use the product router. And the path is just going to be product. And now let's define some basic get methods here first. So this is going to be the home page. We're just going to return some random thing. We're going to define an h1 tag that says Node.js CRUD API, and then let's have a h4 tag that says the message success, and then have a paragraph. That defines the version number. We're also going to have a health check, which is also a get method. It sends an empty body. And then finally, we're going to have the app listen to the port that we defined. And then just log out something like demo app is up and listening to port. Alright, so that's it for the app.js file. And now we're going to define this product route. So we're going to create a new directory called routes. And then inside this folder, we're going to call it product.js. One thing to note here is when we define the router, we don't have to write out .js at the end. Alright, first thing first, we're going to import some libraries here. So constant express, and then we're going to define a constant called router. And then we're going to import the AWS SDK. And then we're going to update the region to be US East 1. And the reason for that is our Dynamo table is in the East region. And now let's define the DynamoDB clients. And then we're going to define the table name as a constant. And I believe we call it product inventory. And now we're ready to define the CRUD methods. So the first one is going to be a get method, where we can get a single item from it. And then the second one is also a get method, where we get all the products in our table. And then the next one is a post method, where we can save a new product into our table. And then the next one is a patch method, where we can update the item in the table. And then lastly, we're going to have a delete method that we can use to delete an item on the table. And then finally, we're going to export this as a module called router. And now we just need to define the details for all these methods. But for the interest of time, I'm going to speed up the video, but I'll include a link down below where you can find all the code. So let's get started. Alright, so I just finished writing the code. But before we move on to the next step, I want to point out a few things. The first thing is that for all the callback functions, I use an async function. And the reason for that is all the DynamoDB operations are async functions, so I have to call it async functions here as well. And then the second thing is for the error handling. I'll just log them out right here and then send a 500 back to the client. But you can do your custom handling here if you want to. And then lastly, in the method when we try to query all the items in the table, I define a custom function called scan Dynamo records, which is defined here. And the reason I do it this way is that when Dynamo performs a scan on the table, it may not be able to get all the items all at once because there's a size limit on it. And if this time it cannot get all the items in the table, it's going to return something called the last evaluated key, which means that is the point it ended. So we're going to add that as a parameter and then do the scan again. And we're doing it recursively here. And now let's test our app locally before we deploy that to Elastic Beanstalk. So I'm going to go to terminal, new terminal, and then do node app.js, enter. I forgot to install the module. So what I can do is npm installed. And what it does is that it just gonna install everything that we define in the package.json file and then create a new folder with all the libraries. So now if we do it again, it's up and running. And now let's go to our browser, open a new tab, open the DevOps tool and then network, close everything, and then type in localhost 3000. Alright, now we can see our app's running, and then this is 200, means it's okay. And then if we go to the health, it's also 200. So we're good to move on to the next step. And now let's go back to AWS. I'll type in Elastic Beanstalk, open tab into a new tab, create application. For the name, I just call it Meister CRUD Node.js CRUD API. For the platform, I choose Node.js. And then for the runtime, I just choose Node.js 12 because I think that's what I have in my local machine. Yep, but you can choose Node.js 14 if you want to. And then I'll upload my own code. And I can just go back here. So remember, for the Node modules, this is what we installed when we test locally. But when we upload that to Elastic Beanstalk, we don't have to include that into our deployment package. Because when Elastic Beanstalk sees the package.json file, it will just install the module for you automatically. And we don't need this either. There's one more file we need to make before we can create a deployment package. It's called the proc file. So this is the file that Elastic Beanstalk will look for in the deployment process, so that it knows what command to run to start the app. Technically, if we name our entry point to be app.js or index.js, we don't have to create this file because Elastic Beanstalk will look for those files automatically. But if you name it differently, you would have to use this file to tell it what to run to start the app. But as a good practice, I'm going to use it anyway. Just do web node app.js. So it's basically telling Elastic Beanstalk to run this command to start the application after it gets deployed. And now we're ready to create a deployment package. So let's go to the folder, select everything, compress. One thing to note is that all these files have to be in the root directory, so you have to compress it this way. And now let's go back to Elastic Beanstalk, local file, and then choose the file that we just created. It's this one. Hit open. We're going to leave everything as default for the configuration, but let's take a look at it and see what setting you can change. In here you can choose other instance type, but I'm just gonna choose this one because it's free. And then you can change the runtime. Software, you can change the proxy server to be Apache, but I'm gonna use Nginx. And other things you can do. And then you can also change the load balancing setting and then security groups and stuff like that. But I'm just gonna leave everything as default for this demo. So create app. I think this is gonna take about 15 minutes. I'm just gonna pause the video and then come back. Alright, so it's been 20 minutes and seems like the creation is done. And now let's look at it and see if it's working. So if I click on go to environment, and seems like it's working. But there's one more thing we need to do before we can do operations on the DynamoDB, which is to give the EC2 instance permission to operate on the Dynamo table. And we're going to do that using the IAM policy. So let's go to configuration, and under security, you may see that there are two rows here. One is the IAM instance profile, and then the other one is the service row. So the service row is being used by Elastic Beanstalk to create the EC2 instance, and this is the actual row that is being used by the EC2 instance to do the operations. So we're going to add it to this one. So I'm just going to copy this, type in IAM, open that into a new tab. And then paste it here. Alright, so this is it. I'm gonna do attach policy. Type in Dynamo. So for this demo, I'm just gonna give it full permission. Alright, so it's done. Go back to Elastic Beanstalk. Click here. Alright, so this is the endpoint for our API, so I'm just gonna copy this. And then open Postman. So do HTTP and then paste it here. Let's do a GET request on the home page. Now we're getting that. And then check the health. It's 200, so it's fine. And now let's do a post to create some items on our table. We need to have a product ID, and there needs to be a string. And then let's do color. Let's do red, and then price. $100. Before we hit the request, let's go to Dynamo table to make sure that we don't have anything here first. So it's empty. So I hit send. Oops, not helped. It should be product. Remember, that is our path that we define here. So let's do send again. Missing required key item in the parameter. There might be a typo. Let's see. Post. Item, not items. Now let's deploy that one more time. To go back to Elastic Beanstalk. This is good, so I can show you how to deploy that again. So just hit upload, choose the file, and that is the updated version of the package. Hit upload. Version 2, deploy. Okay, it's done. Let me do refresh on it. It's using the version 2 code. Now let's go back to Postman and do it again. Alright, so it's successful. Now let's go back to DynamoDB. Hit refresh. We see one item here. Let's save let's create a few more. Blue 200, and then 3, $500. And now if we go back, we should see 3 items here, and there you go. Now let's test out the get method for a single item. Just do get, and then remember when we write the code for the get item, we are getting the product ID from the query parameter. So we're going to pass in, so we don't need this, the parameter to be product ID. You can either do it here or just do a question mark and do it over there. 02, and that should return the second item. Yep. And then if I do the first one, it should return the first item. And now let's get all the items, so we don't need this. And for getting all the items, I remember we say that we're gonna have all at the end for the path. And it should return all 3 items to us. And yes. And now let's modify one of the items, which is a patch method. And we're going to pass in a product ID. Let's see what we're going to pass in first. We're going to pass in a product ID, and then updated key, and then updated value from the body. Product ID, let's change the second one. We're gonna change update key, we're gonna change the price, and we're gonna change it to 1,000. So right now the second item is $200. If I do send, it's gonna be changed to $1,000. It's successful. If I refresh, it's $1,000. And right now let's delete the third item. And I believe we passed that in as the body as well. And the method is going to be delete. Now we have 3 items here. If I do send, we're going to have 2 left. So this is successful. And if we do a refresh, we're going to have 2 left. And there you go. One last thing I want to mention is that in Elastic Beanstalk, if you want to look at the logs to see what the problem is, if you have any, you just click here and then just do request log, hit here, and you'll be able to download the logs for the app. Let's take a look. So in here you see all the system logs as well as the app logs. And then if you want to update the version, the code, you just create a package and then hit upload and deploy, and then you're done. And that is it, everyone. I hope you have learned something. If you like this video, I hope you can give it a thumbs up, and I'll see you in the next video.